the mist, a stone's throw from the precipice paused. Did he jump or did he fall as he gazed into the morning mist?
Right before we went on the air, this little conversation came up about what would happen if Sisyphus just decided he didn't want to roll the rock anymore. Like, I'm just not doing this. I assume the gods of the underworld would have just picked out something way worse for him to do. You know, you should be happy with your rock. Anyway, we're going to talk today about the myth of Sisyphus. We're going to talk to a musician later on, a composer who incorporated his feelings and thoughts about that into a work of jazz. We'll also talk at the end about, in fact, the act of quitting, deciding to stop, the exact thing that Sisyphus can't really do. But we do want to frame this whole story up with somebody who really understands it. Joel Christensen is joining us once again, a professor of classical studies, a senior associate dean for faculty affairs at Brandeis University. His newest book is The Many-Minded Man, The Odyssey, Psychology, and the Therapy of Epic. Joel Christensen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back again.
So we should say, first of all, that within the world that you are navigating all the time, you know, Sisyphus is around, right? He either gets cameos or name checks in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Plato has Socrates talking about how, you know, when he dies, he'll kind of get to chop it up with Sisyphus. Although it's unclear to me how that's going to work. He's going to have to walk alongside him up the hill or something. But he's, I mean, this is a story that would have been pretty well known, I think. Sisyphus would be a mythological celebrity, sort of.
Well, yeah, and he's definitely, you know, he's positioned as part of a story tradition that's there before the stories we know about. And so one of the fascinating things about Sisyphus is that he prefigures the Iliad, the Odyssey, most of Greek tragedy. We have, you know, early images of his punishment, but the first occurrences we have of Sisyphus are as the ancestor in the Iliad, and then someone being punished in the underworld in the Odyssey without any mention of why he's there.
Yeah.
And so the basic presumption we can make is that ancient audiences knew the story. They knew why he was in the underworld, and they were familiar with that fate.
Is he the father of Glaucus in the Iliad?
Yeah. So, well, you know,
exchanges
sort of
the
like
armor with
grandsire.
Diomedes. Yeah, grandsire.
Yeah. So he's there,
Yeah.
and in some traditions, he is an ancestor of Odysseus as well.
So we should say that Greek myths were oral traditions. They are therefore narratively kind of unstable. You know, ask 10 different ancient Greeks to tell you the story. You might get 10 different stories. But I don't know, to the degree that there's any kind of canonical version at all, what would you say it was?
Well, I think, you know, the canonical version starts with the punishment, which is, you know, Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill. But the background for why he has that punishment is fairly stable, but we get it in sort of later authors, and a mythographer named Pherecydes tells it the whole tale, and basically works this way. Zeus was having an affair with Aegina, an island, but also a person. Sisyphus found out about it, and basically, you know, was punished for intervening in the affair in a way. It's unclear what happened. And so Zeus sends Thanatos to kill him, and Sisyphus figures out what's going on. Somehow he binds death, and he stops death from happening, and everybody lives on. And so Zeus, of course, can't have this happening for reasons I could go on about if you'd like, and stops the situation, and sends Sisyphus to the underworld to really die. And so the first thing that happens is he's just killed because he intervenes in Zeus's love affairs. But he has a trick. And his trick is that his wife, Merope, doesn't perform the burial rites for him. And somehow he's free to roam after this. And he comes back to the upper world and wants to continue on by reproaching his wife for what's happened. And he stays there again, and he dies of old age, according to one version, and then goes to the underworld where he's given this punishment. And the justification, according to the Athenian mythographer, Pherecydes, is that the rock is there to keep him from getting out of the underworld, right? And so it's the repetition that we think of when we think of the pinwheel and Sisyphus isn't as much a deal as the fact that the stone's really heavy and it's hard for him to get away. It's like slowing him down. And so that's the earliest version of the full tale that we have.
So, in that sense, and we'll get to Camus and stuff like that in just a second, but I think, in modern life, to the extent that we think about Sisyphus, we either think about the adjective, and we can get to that too, or we think about that idea of kind of absurdist existentialism. But for the Greeks, it sounds like he's a little bit more in the tradition of Odysseus and Prometheus, kind of a tricky guy, a guy who sometimes wants to get the upper hand of the gods. And then, like all stories of the Greek underworld, it is a sort of F around and find out story,
Right. And
he
comes from a family, like it comes from a period in myth that I usually describe as the sort of fall from Eden in Greek myth, where we get a like explanation for why having the gods and human beings together isn't a great idea. Sisyphus, in some traditions, has a brother named Salmoneus, who tried to rival Zeus by driving around in a chariot, throwing burning torches at people, pretending he's Zeus that way. And of course, if you do that, Zeus is going to strike you down with lightning. And so it's this period where people are, stories are exploring notions of hubris and what it means to be human. And I think the central sort of motif of that tale is that there's a difference between being immortal and mortal. And what we find out from that, I think, is that the gods live lives that are unchanging. They go on forever. And part of the notion of Homeric epic is that human beings have value in life because our lives are limited. The fact that it's a limited commodity and that our lives can change and that we're not static forever makes our lives important. Whereas the gods who live forever, like nothing ever happens, they can't change their deals. They have to constantly be the same thing. So in a way, Sisyphus's punishment fits his crime because he goes on forever in the underworld doing the same thing. It's the inverse of mortality.
Yeah, and of course, as you pointed out before the show, the other irony or paradox here is that his crime has to do with seeking a certain kind of immortality, and he gets it. He gets an adjective. There's no Zeusian adjective. He gets an adjective. Say a little bit about that too.
Well, the adjective, we talk about it now. A Sisyphean task is one that's endless and maybe pointless. And I often contrast it, in English with Heraclean, which is a task that's stupendous and, superhuman. And the joke I make.
Unless you're mucking at stables. Anyway, continue.
Right. But the joke I usually make is a task can be Sisyphean or it can be Heraclean. But if it's both, then you're pretty much screwed because you have endless drudgery with a task you can never actually complete.
So Camus does look at this, and he has it sort of fits an argument that he wants to make. He wants to make the argument that life is essentially a search for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. And that there, and also he says in that sort of that short work of nonfiction, it's also life is really, really boring, and just the way that you described. I mean, but it's not like being a god where you sit there all day and you make every free throw you take. It's boring because it's just boring and it's monotonous and tedious. And so I don't know. He turns Sisyphus, I think, into a slightly different figure, one that the Greeks might not recognize.
Well, he does. I mean, I think to start with sort of his ending premise, right, that's fit really well for Twitter and social media, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Right. Yeah. I mean, it flies in the face of every way that Greek myth is, or at least the myth of Sisyphus is used in antiquity. But what I think is interesting is I don't think that it flies in the face of the practice of Greek myth, which is to reinterpret things and reconsider them from every angle possible. And so, earlier when we were talking about this, one of the things that I tried to emphasize is I think that Camus' retelling or rethinking of Sisyphus is very appropriate to sort of the post-industrial age, to a post-agrarian period. And at some level, we have to think about sort of the materiality of human life, right? Like once you move from subsistence living and from the constant threat of everything killing you, you have the opportunity to be bored. Right. And at some basic level, like this is tied to sort of academic inquiry to begin with, because at the core, the word scholarship is related to that Greek word skole, which means leisure time. The notion that these are the conversations we can only have if we have leisure, if we're not working, if we're not fighting, if we're not slaving away every day. And so while, I think Socrates might talk to Camus and be like, it's kind of weird what you're doing with Sisyphus there, I don't think he would necessarily find it to be impossible just a little strange.
Yeah, I think the other reason that it survives for us, I mean, this is very connected to what you just said too, is, I mean, I don't know, I'm host a weekday talk show, so getting one done, reaching the top, is simply the beginning of starting to do another one. And I think to whatever extent our lives feel like that, and I think probably everybody has a version of that the achievement of the task is simply a way of creating a new beginning for our repetition of the past. That has an uneasy familiarity.
It does, and there's something there in that word repetition you just used that I think gives us an opportunity through comparing it to Sisyphus to really get to the core of the difference, right? We often talk about repetition, but we don't differentiate it from, say, iteration. So, if you and I were to pick up a stone and roll it up a hill, the first time we did it would actually be completely different in an essential way for us from the second time. Right? Because our body memory, our experience of it, the pacing, everything about it would change. And so, the notion that Sisyphus himself is going through this endless task where nothing changes is frightening, but also contrasts with our lives. So, like Camus, to go back to Camus and his exploration of sort of the mortal condition, it's more about the repetition without the hope of change. And that notion there, the existential notion of the futility of human life, that Camus worries about and sort of ties into the Sisyphean thing, is not necessarily part of the Greek mindset. To go back to Glaucus, who we mentioned before, and his story, the notion that human lives are like the leaves of the trees that fall with every generation. He flirts with the idea of futility, but at the same time, he's in a narrative that's constantly emphasizing how much human action matters.
Yeah, let's give Glaucus a little extra credit too, because it's very common in professional sports these days. At the end of a game, sometimes players will exchange jerseys. Yeah,
Yeah, they do.
He started. He and Diomedes, they started that stuff, right?
Well, also, to be fair to Glaucus, people often agree with the narrative's criticism of him that he gave up gold armor for bronze. But the point I always made is he got to walk away from Diomedes, who just murdered everybody. He wins.
Right. He talked his way out of that one.
He did.
So maybe let's just veer back towards ancient Greece for a second, and it's hard to know these things, but typically a myth like this one does seem like a cautionary and kind of proscriptive tale. Don't make the gods mad. Don't get out of line. No, stay in your lane. Yeah. Is that what it is? Do we think that it was sort of a cautionary tale? I mean, some Greek myths are just ripping good yarns. They're just fun to talk about. This one doesn't feel quite that way.
Well, so as I was mentioning before, it's from a period where stories are being told to discourage hubris, to sort of develop a metaphysical baseline on what it is to be a human being, right? And the story of Sisyphus is set within other really bad people. So there's a famous relief, people can look it up, that has Sisyphus, Ixion, and Tantalus all punished together on the same relief, as Sisyphus lifting the stone, Ixion on a wheel, Tantalus trying to eat. But I feel like their punishments and their crimes are of a very different quality. Ixion tried to rape Hera, Tantalus fed the gods his own children, and Sisyphus tried to conquer death. Right. And so when I talk about these myths, I mean, they establish, as I said, that metaphysical baseline on the difference between the humans and the gods. And I think there's a lesson to Sisyphus that's less harsh morally than the others. And his lesson, I think, again, is that, is that the gods and the afterlife is endless drudgery. And so perhaps you should think about the life you're living now. There may be a, memento mori aspect to this tale of Sisyphus that's also there with the trickster thing, with the don't challenge the gods, and, you're all going to die as well.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but it's also, I can't cite text at all, but I feel like whether you're reading the Aeneid or reading about Orpheus or any of the people who get a tour of the underworld and come back out.
They point to him.
It's like Studio 54. It's like, oh, yeah, there's that celebrity over there, except they're all people who are being tortured in the afterlife. And I think maybe you get to see Sisyphus there once in a while. But you're suggesting I hadn't really thought about that, but maybe there is sort of a carpe diem argument argument here. It's like it could really suck later on. So maybe you should be doing the stuff that you really want to do right now.
Also, there's this undercurrent about immortality, right? In the Iliad and other texts, you risk your life now, you get a short life, you get eternal glory. But the undercurrent of that is that's actually not you. You don't live on forever. The real life is right now. And so I think part of that, so that appeals to us. But I think another thing to think about in the attractiveness of the Sisyphus story is it's almost like the original meme. Or it's a set of an original memes. No, because it's such a simple image. Like it sticks in your head. It's easy to carry with you. It has a story embedded within it. And it's malleable. The way we've just talked about it, 15 minutes, 15 different interpretations. Like it's got that meme heavy load that makes it easy to travel from one narrative to another.
That's a great point. I mean, it's one of those, nobody gets Sisyphus mixed up with anybody else. You see a picture of a guy rolling a rock up a hill, you think, now which way, is that Tantalus? No, I mean, nobody's confused at all. It has that kind of staying power. Before we run out of time, I should just point out that one other person who was very interested, a somewhat modern person who was interested in Sisyphus, at least particularly in his youth, was Kafka, who of course also got an adjective. That's they both got adjectives. But Kafka's working, his main job, he's working for an insurance company. He's just pumping out reports and stuff like that. And sort of one of Kafka's implicit questions is this as meaningless as it seems? Yeah. And you can see how that's also kind of interesting, that the punishment itself seems very arbitrary. Like it's a rock, you got to roll it up. Why you got to roll the rock up the hill? I don't know. You just do. And to me, that's like another component of this story.
Right. The rock. And so I don't know that I've ever seen an explanation for why a rock, or if it's a special rock, right? They're heavy. Why lift them? Yeah. Right. But I do think, I think that essential difference between the modern condition and the ancient one really helps us to explain the interpretation, right? To go back, to Thomas Hobbes type story, life in ancient Greece was nasty, brutish, and short. The amount of people who got to be a Plato or Socrates to really contemplate whether or not like our lives were futile would have been few. And Kafka, working in insurance companies sucks, but like his material life was so different than most of the people in antiquity. And we now have the time to think about it. And again, that goes back to, I think the adaptability of the Sisyphus character goes back to that meme nature, right? We read it in different ways now because our experience of life is different, but it's still a reflection of human life, right? If we waste what we have now and we try to strive for more than we were supposed to, like what is the future that we actually have? It's still death, it's still a drudgery. Or we waste our life now, we don't think about its value, and we're living dead people. And so it's that notion of Sisyphus now where we're living the Sisyphean life before we die that may be the most tragic thing.
That's a very, very dark note to end on, but I don't mind that at all.
I apologize.
No, that's okay. I don't mind it at all. I feel like now I'm feeling like he's under merchandise. You and I should be putting out some T-shirts and
Absolutely.
stuff like that. Joel Christensen, we're so lucky to have you, Professor of Classical Studies and Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at Brandeis. His newest book is The Many-Minded Man, The Odyssey, Psychology, and the Therapy of Epic. We're going to take a little break, a very, very short break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk to a composer who has his own view of Sisyphus, and who is somebody very well known to many of you. It's Noah Behrman, and who created a jazz work that embodied or embraced his idea of Sisyphus. And then towards the end, as I said, one of the whole ideas of Sisyphus is you don't get to quit. You never can give it up. Well, what if you can? Does that make things different? Does that make the story different? We'll find out.
Every day I push. Yet the rock never makes it all the way to the top. push to coax beautiful music out of a broken body. I push to be the parent who always does the right thing. I push to love and heal the whole world. Yet the rock never makes it all the way to the top.
You're hearing the spoken words and
Could call my
playing
life
of Noah Behrman, a pianist, composer, educator, friend of the show, friend just in general. He is director of Wesleyan University Jazz Ensemble, artistic director of the nonprofit Resonance Motion. His most recent album is Live at the Side Door. This is from an earlier album called The Rock and the Redemption. It was recorded in 2015. It is very explicitly connected to the myth of Sisyphus. And joining us is, in fact, the composer himself, Noah Behrman. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Colin. And to clarify, what you're listening to now is actually not even on the album. It's part of a little promo piece that I made with an animation by my wife, Kate Tenike, surrounding the production of that work of art.
And the animation's great, too. People should just check this out on the YouTubes. So maybe just begin by talking a little bit about the high concept of this album. What were you trying to illustrate with music that was connected to this myth?
Well, I guess I should start by clarifying, having read some of the work of your other panelists, that there's sort of a distinction between finite, quantifiable tasks or accomplishments or milestones and ones that are a bit more potentially abstract or open-ended. And love and justice, and a case could be made artistic ambition, all have the potential to be either. And so the overall concept is that you could look at Sisyphus as someone who, in the act of pushing the boulder every day, was becoming physically strong and emotionally resilient, and importantly, detached from this binary notion of success and failure. And really, by this definition, Sisyphus was not only a hero, but a fulfilled person who could only be deemed a failure or a tragic figure through the lens of this finite sense that only if you accomplish this finite thing in a measurable and irreversible way could you be deemed successful. And for me, I find it useful to question that conclusion and to actually think about how much one can accomplish in one's life if one is willing to fail but achieve something noteworthy in the act of trying to succeed at something that logically is impossible.
Yeah, I think, first of all, kind of priced into existence and probably creative existence, and a lot of the work that both of us do really is this idea of reset. You get something done, you have to do something else. I've been doing a daily talk show for a long, long time now, and that's just the reality of it. You get a really good one done, and you think, oh, that was great. What are we doing tomorrow? And I think for creative people like you, it's a similar thing, right? You get a thing done, and the good news is you get to do another one. But it's also a little bit maybe of the futility that is sometimes imputed to Sisyphus.
I guess, yeah. Well, and I think in a sense, getting a thing done can have these two simultaneous angles. One is that, of course, there are finite tasks. If I'm making a record, there is completing the recording process and completing the mixing and doing all the logistics to disseminate it to the world. Those are all finite benchmarks that I can achieve or fail to achieve, and even learning the correct notes to a piece of music by the time that I have to share it with somebody. And yet, coupled with this and concurrent with it is this broader pursuit, this quest for transcendence, if you will, that I find on the macro level is a fulfilling and on some level perpetually unsatisfying by the very nature of not getting there way to be. But even on a micro level, I find that if I'm trying to make this piano solo the most deeply expressive thing I've ever done. I know rationally that it won't be, or that it is statistically highly unlikely that it will be. And yet I tend to get closer to that outcome than if I said, okay, let's just make this not suck. I can aim for a 5 out of 10, and I'm pretty sure I can nail that. So let's just do that, as opposed to aiming for a 10 out of 10, winding up with a 7, and simultaneously getting farther and being more conscious of the extent to which I failed to reach what I was aiming for.
Yeah, and another thing that's sort of interesting about the story of Sisyphus is he does reach the top. That's the problem.
Right.
He does reach the top. He doesn't stop at 7 or get stopped at 7, but there's still the reset. I think there's also a sense. I love your interpretation of Sisyphus. I love the way that you see it as a possibly comforting story or an inspiring story. But there is, indubitably a certain amount of suffering and toil that's implied by it. And I think it's there also in the voiceover we heard with your music. I mean, you struggle with a congenital condition that affects your hands, and you're a pianist. That's right there, I think, in your thinking about this story, right?
Oh, for sure. Thank you. And I'm glad it resonates with you. And I think there's this weird, abstraction, maybe it's not weird for some of your listeners, but of becoming less attached to being attached to things going well. So on some level, there is suffering and toil because we're humans, and it's part of the human condition, and suffering is unavoidable. And so the question is, what quality of spirit can you maintain amidst that? So it's not that I am completely immune to the disappointments and tangible repercussions of failing to meet the things that the benchmarks I'm aiming for. And yet I keep working to become better at detaching from that. I'm simultaneously aware of the ways that I fell short in this particular pursuit and ways that I want to get better, and also not fixating on that viewpoint. Just looking at, okay, this is just today's iteration of my futile but hopefully somewhat valiant attempt to manifest my higher self in my real world actions.
Yeah, so there's that daily struggle, and it's totally implied by Sisyphus. But we're not Sisyphus. We don't have the same job every single day, and we don't have the same struggles every single day. Not to bring us into a dark place, but I think it's kind of inevitable. There are two, really horrible tragedies that I think cast themselves over your work. One of them was the murder of Claire Randall, the vocalist who's actually heard on that album. And then later, of course, your very dear friend and collaborator, Jimmy Green, lost his daughter, Anna Grace, at Sandy Hook. And I just know you well enough to know that somehow or other you took some of the thinking that you did about Sisyphus and used it as you thought about how to respond, how to feel, how to survive these two horrible heartbreaks. Can you say a little bit about how those go together?
Well, it's sort of concurrent. Sandy Hook was in 2012 and Claire was murdered in 2016. And I had already conceived this idea of Sisyphus, and in a sense it became a coping mechanism for me as I have continued to aim to, I don't even want to say heal, although I hope there's been some healing, but to live with, I guess, endure that. And I guess I would respectfully say that for me, it is the same boulder every day in the macro sense, like love, justice, trying to facilitate transcendent experiences through art, basic humanity. The guises are different every day, and the obstacles and the opportunities to treat a particular situation through the lens of stubbornly maintaining my quest for those big picture spiritual states and actions. So I increasingly view the micro daily stuff as just today's guise for what is ultimately a fairly consistent thing. When we look at the moment we're in politically, I feel like on one level, everything's changed and everything's awful and we're all in trouble and so on. And through another lens, on a spiritual level, this need to identify and protect the vulnerable and behave in a principled manner in the face of adversity, that was going to be true in a best or worst case scenario, and what it's actually going to mean in terms of action steps and realistic assessments of the efficacy of a particular mode of activism, for example. All of that has changed, but the core mission, I expect, is going to be the same for each day that I'm fortunate enough to draw breath from now till whenever that is.
Let me just ask you one more thing about that, which is, or about everything that we've been talking about and about Sisyphus, which is, I think, our reaction to hardship, to tragedy, to, the kinds of rather frightening possibilities that exist right now, in the late fall, early winter of 2024. I think our reaction is often, let this cup pass from me. I just don't want to have to deal with it, and I've, in my own personal life, starting in 2020, started to have to deal with some things that I just didn't want to have to deal with, but they were there. And I'm wondering, talking to you and listening to the music before we got on the air, I'm thinking about, if you think of this as there is always going to be a rock, and you are always going to be one of the people who pushes a rock up a hill, because everybody is one of those people.
Everybody is.
Yeah. It's an interesting place to start, anyway, thinking about how you react emotionally to even the stuff that you just described about the current political moment, but react to that.
I hopefully John Dankosky is listening and will appreciate that for the first time in my life, I'm going to quote a Rush song and say, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And on some level, one of the few things that we hopefully are able to maintain just as human beings is agency. And we have limited agency over what the obstacles are. And, it's a familiar trope that we can control how we respond to those things. But it's ultimately true. Like, I can either let things happen to me or let things happen in my sphere, or I can think about, how am I going to feel when I look in the mirror at the end of the day before I turn off the light? Am I going to think the person looking back at me made reasonable efforts towards pursuing their higher purpose? And if I look back and mirror Noah says, yeah, I think I did all right today, then it doesn't make things less scary on either the global level or the personal struggle level, but at least there's a sense of, I might aim for a kind of transcendence and a kind of spreading of peace and love and so on that I know is ultimately logically unattainable under these current conditions. I still think I'll get closer to where I'm trying to get to if I treat it as though it's attainable on that sort of core heart level.
Yeah, I'm relating to, I'm suddenly thinking of the scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's this piece of very heavy kind of hydraulic equipment in the psych ward, and Randall McMurphy challenges himself to lift it up. And he strains and strains and strains, and he can't do it. But then he looks around at the other patients who he's been trying to motivate all along, and he said, but I tried, damn it. And maybe that's where we start. We try, damn it.
We try, and, that was a workout for him. Yeah. So if you don't get it all the way up, it's not wasted effort. If you're being clear-headed and clear-hearted about what the role of that rock actually is.
We're going to have to stop there. Noah Behrman, pianist, composer, educator, director of the Wesleyan University Jazz Ensemble, artistic director of the nonprofit Resonance Motion. His most recent album is Live at the Side Door. He'll be back with us very soon for our year-end jazz review. But for now, we'll say goodbye, and we've got one more set of stories to tell you right after this. Time to say some thank yous. First of all, to the maestro, Dylan Reyes, our technical producer. This particular broadcast was brought to you by Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions. I don't love everything they do, but I think this has been an excellent episode. And we are about to talk to somebody who has, I don't envy that many people their jobs because I really like my job, but I think being the New Yorker's ideas editor sounds like a lot of fun. And Joshua Rothman, unfortunately, already has that job, writes the weekly column Open Questions, and did explore Sisyphus in the connection of whether or not, unlike Sisyphus, we should occasionally decide to give up on something perhaps less onerous than rolling a rock up a hill and seeing it roll back down. So first of all, Josh, welcome to our conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it seems to me that we are dealing with Sisyphus and with the piece that you wrote, which was inspired by two books that you'd read and kind of reviewed about quitting. There's sort of two questions. One is that whole endlessness of the task. Can you ever get out of it? And then the other one is the boredom of it. And I think both of those things are contained in your piece. But what you really are exploring is, can you quit something that's really bothering you? And also this kind of valorization of sticking to it. Stick-to-itiveness has kind of a nice brand these days. So maybe we should start there. Where do we think that comes from? What's the value of just sticking to something for the sake of doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an intuition we all have, right? That, basically it's like heroic, or it speaks well of your character, that you don't give up on stuff and that you stick with it, that you keep going, you have grit. I mean, I think that's a very natural idea. And, like when, my son is 6, he's in first grade. It's like if he finds some math thing on his homework card, you say, don't give up. Like there's a whole time of your life where, giving up on things is basically a really bad idea. And it's really important that you learn how to stick with stuff. And then one of the interesting things that happens is that, as you get older and things get more complicated and you find yourself enmeshed in stuff that you maybe don't want to keep doing, you have to learn a new skill, which is like, when is it okay to actually say, I'm finished with this, even if maybe you haven't finished in quite the way you want it.
Yeah, the valorization of stick-to-itiveness is just so, and the heroic qualities attributed to stick-to-itiveness is just so pervasive that it actually becomes kind of a comic trope in the movie Galaxy Quest, where they have a motto that just gets said over and over again. C1, Maestro.
Never give up.
Never give up.
Never surrender.
Never surrender.
And that just said all the time, never give up, never surrender. But in a way, and I think your piece kind of brings this forward a little bit, Josh, there's this, I think, reality that sometimes giving up is a hard thing to do. Repetitive tasks can be comfortable, or we get stuck in a place that we're relatively comfortable. The idea of giving up does take a heroic effort sometimes. And also, as you point out, sometimes just life forces you to make adjustments, even though you might be kind of happy with the way things are.
So in the piece that I wrote, I was writing about two books that came at this giving up question from sort of different sides. One was a book by a guy named Oliver Burkeman, who writes about productivity and work. And he wrote this book called Meditations for Mortals, which is about the idea that basically, on the one hand, in order to achieve anything in life, you have to work, you have to have tenacity. But on the other hand, there's certain parts of life where it's actually impossible to complete the task. It's never going to happen. Like, for example, in order to be an informed person, you have to read the news every day, but you're never going to read all the news. That's impossible. There has to be a point where you say, I've read enough. I give up on reading the news for today. I've decided I'm going to give up on the dream of being like perfectly 100% informed. And of course, if you can give up on that, then you make room in your life for new stuff. So there's one side of it which has to do with sort of productivity and allocating your time. The other book was by a psychoanalyst named Adam Phillips. The book's called On Giving Up. And he comes at it from a different angle that I really kind of expanded my mind. He basically says, we don't want to give up on stuff because we connect it on some level in our heads with death. Like, we don't like giving up because we think it's a type of like existential failure. And it sounds far-fetched in some ways. And then in other ways, I found it to be intuitively true. Like, let's say that you're older and you're thinking maybe, your kids have moved out and you're thinking, I'm going to give up on managing this big house. I'm going to move into an apartment. That's an ordinary example that has that existential dimension. His idea is that we kind of like read that into all sorts of other ways of giving up. We say, I'm in a job I don't like, and I'm going to give up on making it work, and I'm going to find a new job. And we say, well, maybe I'm just a loser. Like, maybe I've just failed in some deep way. And that's like a huge mistake in his version of things. It's really important that you learn how to stop doing things without reading into the stopping sort of more than is warranted, because actually there's ways of simply stepping away from things. And he has a good example of, I don't know if this happens to you, sometimes late at night, I just don't want to go to bed. I just like, I'm doing something, I just want to keep doing it. But, part of being a grown-up is saying, I guess I'm not going to finish reading this chapter tonight. I'm just going to close the book and start again, start something new the next day. There's a kind of benign way of giving up. And I found that to be a really compelling idea.
The earlier point that he makes is one that I'm wrestling with myself almost constantly. I'm a 70-year-old man. I just turned 70 a month ago. I'm a 70-year-old man doing a weekday radio show. And I feel like if I stop, I'm just marking time until death. It's kind of like...
Yeah, well, one of the things that happened to me in my life that I made me interested in this topic to begin with is before I was a journalist, I was a grad student in English literature, and my goal in life was to become an English professor. And around the time that I was finishing up my PhD, which I didn't finish, on which I gave up, the 2008 financial crash happened, and the job market diminished. There weren't that many jobs for professors. And I had an advisor who said to me, you don't have to do the same thing for your whole life. It's okay to do something different. You've been doing this, you've been having one type of career for a while, and there's nothing wrong with giving up on that and doing something different. And I think the idea that actually not giving up is, obviously it has upsides, but it also involves, tying yourself to the mast. It involves depriving yourself of freedom. And so there's always this trade-off between sort of tenacity and freedom is important to remember.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that and wondering whether it's a false dichotomy. I mean, it certainly has a lot of legitimacy, but, and Bergsman cites a Zen master to make one of his points, but other Zen masters will say, no, if you're fully present in the task you're doing, chop wood, carry water, that kind of thing. Not just Zen masters, I would say Yoda and Mr. Miyagi also say these things, that if you're fully present, fully engaged in something, that's its own kind of reward, that be here and now quality to it, that change isn't necessarily the thing that will bring you enlightenment or rewards. I mean, maybe it will, but maybe just paying attention to what you're actually doing, like Sisyphus does, is rewarding in its own way.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, well, I should say, so this column I wrote on giving up, I got a lot of emails about it. A lot of people said, I basically, they saw the headline and they thought, wow, like maybe I should. Maybe the headline was, should you give up? So I think, anecdotally, it seems to me a lot of people are, in our lives, maybe we could say in our lives, we have different types of things we're involved in. And some of them we need to be more tenacious. And some of them, maybe we need to allow ourselves to give up. I mean, that's sort of an easy thing to say. But to me personally, the hardest thing about giving up is just that you don't know what the future holds. So, like if, you're trying to write a book, for example, and at times you say, I've started this book and it just doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And maybe I should give up on this story and write a new story. But, you just don't know whether if you just kept on, the book you're writing wouldn't turn out to be the story you were, like born to tell. So there's this real problem of, giving up means giving up on possibilities, which is hard, but also means opening up new possibilities. And there's just something imponderable about it that's really hard. To me, it's this question of maybe like taking an inventory of your personality and saying, am I overall kind of more biased towards giving up, or am I overall like more biased towards maybe sticking with stuff past the point of diminishing returns? And, asking, should I give myself permission to correct that? That's sort of how I ended up thinking about it.
Yeah, I did a lot of thinking after reading your piece too. And one place that I came to was, and I wonder if this is kind of an American conversation too, because I think change is built into our thinking. I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go to South Dakota. I'm going to make a land claim, and I'm going to start a farm out there. That story has been told over and over again. And I'll tell you, when I saw the movie Man on Wire, the documentary about Philippe Petit, the guy who did the tightrope walk between the towers when they were there, there's a moment where he does this kind of voiceover that has relatively little to do with this incredibly risky, terrifying thing he's about to do. But it's the thing that put me on the edge of my seat. He says, life should be lived on the edge of life. You have to exercise rebellion, to refuse to tape yourself to rules, to refuse your own success, to refuse to repeat yourself, to see every day, every year, every idea as a true challenge. and then you are going to live your life on a tightrope. But Josh, it seems to me he's talking, I mean, his life involves tremendous amounts of time of kind of routine and theoretically possibly monotonous practice, not just tightrope walking, but he's got a whole bunch of other kind of, neo-vaudevillian skills that he's having to work on all the time. But within that framework, he's talking about an attitude, and you don't have to move to South Dakota. You don't have to quit the overarching thing you're doing. It's almost more of an attitude within the circumference of the life you've chosen for yourself. I don't know. What are your reactions?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. I mean, on the one hand, I'd say one of the reasons we don't want to give up is because it's important for our characters and for our lives that we have goals and projects and we pursue them. Another reason we don't want to give up is because we're good worker bees and we've been sort of like conditioned to just live in a routine, to be cogs in a machine. And we become our own masters in that way. We enforce rules upon ourselves. We take on disciplines and take on burdens that, our super egos or whatever say are good for us. And it's a real challenge because, you're fighting yourself. I mean, when we talk about these types of things, you're often the author of your own sort of life plan. And the idea of giving up on the plan that you yourself chose can be kind of brain breaking. I guess the way I feel is, on the one hand, if your problem is you're a worker bee, and we all have that. Like a simple example of a place where I felt I need to give up is, I live a pretty routinized life. I have 2 small kids. I go to the gym every day. They do the same things every day, and I cling to my routine because it provides structure. And the idea that it wouldn't be such a bad thing for me to say to myself, let's take a month and stop doing something that I've been doing and see whether that space that's now open leads to something. It's just important to see that there are types of giving up that are maybe a little closer to the way we give things up for Lent. Like you give things up to kind of renew. That's like an important idea. And then on the flip side, if the issue isn't that you're like a good worker bee, but it's instead that you are like beaten by a task that overmasters you, which is something that we also all have. Like, it's a dopey example, but like in my case, I have my usual litany of goals. Like I'm working on a book. I'm trying to do things with art. Those things are hard to do. It can be helpful to understand that, just because something is hard doesn't mean you can't give up on it. I'm trying to say that in many cases, what giving up evokes is a sort of internal knot in yourself. Like you're the one who tied the knot. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to ask the question, do you want to untie it? And it doesn't necessarily have to reflect on your character or on where you are in your life course. It can just be a decision that you make, just like you make every other decision to decide what to do with your time.
Joshua Rothman, we're going to have to stop there, partly because it's that point of my public radio day where I have to press a bar and I get a food pellet, and those food pellets are good. I'm never leaving this job. I like it here. Joshua Rothman is the New Yorker's ideas editor who writes the weekly column Open Questions. He wrote about this very question. We have enjoyed talking to you, Josh, and we've enjoyed talking to the rest of you who have been presumably listening here, and we will be back with more on subsequent days.